Good evening, and welcome. Tonight's story is one that unfolds slowly, like lamplight spreading across a quiet street at dusk. It is a story of America and alcohol, of belief and rebellion, of law and defiance, and of a man whose name became inseparable from an era that tried, and failed, to legislate human desire. Tonight, we drift into the long, winding history of Prohibition, and through it, the rise and fall of Al Capone. Before the sirens, before the machine guns, before the headlines and courtroom sketches, there was a nation that drank openly and often. Taverns were social anchors. Beer flowed at political meetings, at barn raisings, at family tables. Alcohol was woven into daily life, not hidden, not whispered about, but accepted as ordinary and familiar. And yet, beneath that familiarity, unease was growing. Moral reformers, religious leaders, and especially women, began to look at drink not as comfort, but as cause. Cause of poverty. Cause of violence. Cause of broken homes. As the years passed, the country itself seemed to tighten its posture. Industrial cities swelled. Immigration reshaped neighborhoods. War approached across the Atlantic, bringing with it fear, nationalism, and suspicion. Alcohol, once commonplace, slowly transformed into a symbol of everything America was trying to control. And when the law finally arrived, sudden and absolute, it did not usher in quiet obedience. Instead, it created shadows. In those shadows, new systems formed. New economies breathed. Ordinary people learned to bend rules, then break them, then profit from them. And among the many who stepped forward, one young man from Brooklyn, shaped by violence, loyalty, and ambition, learned how power truly worked. Not loudly at first. Not recklessly. But patiently. This story is not only about crime. It is about structure. About how laws reshape behavior, how cities respond to pressure, how corruption seeps gently before it floods. It is about speakeasies glowing behind unmarked doors, just spilling into alleys, bottles passed hand to hand under the hum of streetlights. It is about politics compromised quietly, about violence that became routine, about celebrity built on fear and generosity alike. And it is about collapse. About the moment when the machinery that elevated a man begins, just as methodically, to dismantle him. When health fails. When the law changes again. When the empire dissolves, leaving behind memory, myth, and cautionary lessons that still echo. Tonight, we will move carefully through this world. From America before Prohibition, through the machinery of organized bootlegging, into the height of Capone's power, and finally into the slow quiet of his fall and the legacy that followed. Each part will linger where history usually rushes. Each moment will breathe. So settle in. Let the noise of the present fade. In the soft stillness of the evening, we begin not with crime, but with a country, raising a glass, unaware that it is about to be taken away. Part 1. America's drinking culture before 1900. As we drift gently into the first chapter of tonight's story, let us step back into an America that feels distant, slower, and surprisingly familiar. An America where drinking was not hidden behind passwords or whispered invitations, but lived openly, woven into the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Before 1900, alcohol was not an outlaw or a temptation lurking in shadows. It was present in kitchens and taverns, at celebrations and funerals, at political rallies and church socials. Beer, cider, rum, and whiskey flowed with a kind of accepted ease. In many households, especially in rural areas, homemade alcohol was as common as bread. Apples became cider. Grain became beer. Excess harvest was preserved not only in jars, but in barrels. Water, in many towns and cities, was unreliable or unsafe. Alcohol, diluted and fermented, was often cleaner. Children drank small beer. Workers drank ale with meals. The line between nourishment and intoxication was not as sharply drawn as it would later become. Drinking was social, practical, and deeply communal. Taverns stood at the heart of American public life. They were not merely places to drink, but places to gather. News was exchanged there. Jobs were offered. Political arguments unfolded beside fireplaces and long wooden tables. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, taverns doubled as post offices, courthouses, and community halls. They were loud at times, yes, but they were also familiar and grounding. A man's local tavern knew his name, his habits, his stories. Alcohol also played a role in labor itself. In farming communities, whiskey rations were common during harvest. On canals and railroads, alcohol was considered a reward for hard physical work. Even in early factories, drink breaks were not unusual. Intoxication was frowned upon, but consumption itself was not considered immoral by default. It was excess, not use, that troubled people. Immigration further enriched this culture. Germans brought beer gardens and brewing traditions. Irish communities centered social life around pubs. Italians introduced wine as a daily companion to meals. Drinking customs became markers of identity, of memory, of belonging in a new land. Alcohol was not just a substance. It was a bridge back to home. And yet, beneath this surface normalcy, cracks were forming. The 19th century was an era of rapid change. Cities grew faster than infrastructure. Industrial labor replaced seasonal rhythms. Families crowded into tenements. Work became repetitive, exhausting, and impersonal. In these new urban spaces, alcohol sometimes ceased to be a social companion and became an escape. Saloons multiplied, especially near factories, offering warmth, light, and camaraderie after long shifts. For many men, the saloon became a second home. For many women, it became a threat. Domestic violence, financial instability, and absentee fathers were increasingly linked, in public discourse, to drinking. Whether alcohol caused these problems or merely accompanied them mattered less than how it felt inside crowded apartments where wages vanished across bar counters. Women, who often bore the consequences without access to the saloon's social power, began to organize. At the same time, America was experiencing a surge of religious revivalism. Protestant movements emphasized personal morality, discipline, and self-control. Drunkenness came to be framed not as a social flaw, but as a moral failing. The idea took hold that alcohol itself was the problem, not circumstance, not poverty, not exploitation, but drink. This shift was subtle at first. Early temperance advocates did not demand abstinence. They called for moderation. Pledges were signed. Sermons delivered. Pamphlets printed. Over time, however, moderation seemed insufficient. Too many pledges were broken. Too many families suffered. By the mid-19th century, alcohol was being recast in the American imagination. What had once been ordinary was becoming dangerous. What had been social was becoming suspect. The saloon, once a civic space, was increasingly portrayed as a den of corruption, especially in cities filled with immigrants who spoke different languages and practiced different customs. Class and culture played quiet roles here. Middle and upper class reformers often viewed working class drinking habits with disdain. Immigrant saloons were seen not only as places of alcohol, but as spaces of political organizing, cultural preservation, and resistance to assimilation. To control alcohol was, in some ways, to control people. Still, as the century closed, prohibition was not inevitable. Drinking remained widespread. Breweries thrived. Distilleries expanded. Alcohol taxes funded governments. Many Americans could not imagine a nation without drink. It was too embedded, too normal, too human. And yet, the ground was shifting. The language around alcohol was changing. The tone was sharpening. Reform movements were learning how to organize, how to lobby, how to influence law. Women were finding their collective voice. Religion was aligning with policy. And slowly, quietly, the idea formed that alcohol could be eliminated, not just discouraged. As we come to the end of this first part, imagine the America of the late 1800s at dusk. Gas lamps flicker on. Saloons glow warmly against darkening streets. Inside, laughter rises, glasses clink, conversations hum. No one knows yet that this world will soon be driven underground. No one knows that the ordinary act of sharing a drink will become an act of defiance. In the stillness that follows, we let that image rest. And when you are ready, we will drift onward, into the movements that sought to close those doors forever. Part 2. Temperance, religion, women's movements, and moral reform. As we ease into the next chapter, the sounds of the saloon soften and recede. The laughter dims. The lamplight fades. In its place, a different kind of gathering begins to take shape. Quieter at first. More deliberate. A movement built not on revelry, but on resolve. The temperance movement did not arrive suddenly, nor did it begin as a demand for absolute prohibition. It emerged gradually, carried on the steady voices of ministers, reformers, and families who believed that alcohol was slowly eroding the moral foundation of the nation. In the early 19th century, temperance meant moderation. Drink less. Drink wisely. Drink only on occasion. It was a plea, not a command. Religion sat at the heart of this shift. Protestant revivalism swept across America in waves, especially during the Second Great Awakening. Camp meetings filled fields. Sermons thundered beneath open skies. Preachers spoke of personal responsibility, self-discipline, and salvation through restraint. Drunkenness was framed as a spiritual failure, a surrender to temptation that weakened the soul and endangered the family. In these sermons, alcohol was no longer neutral. It was a gateway to sin. A force that dulled moral judgment and loosened restraint. The drunkard was not merely unfortunate. He was fallen. And his fall, reformers argued, pulled others down with him. At first, temperance societies welcomed men and women alike. Members signed pledges promising to abstain or moderate. Meetings were orderly, earnest, and deeply moral. Songs were sung. Testimonials shared. Former drinkers stood before audiences and described their redemption. These stories were powerful, emotional, and persuasive. They gave the movement momentum. But as industrialization accelerated, the consequences of drinking became more visible, especially to women. In many households, women managed the finances, raised children, and maintained the home. When wages disappeared into saloons, the effects were immediate. Rent went unpaid. Food ran short. Violence sometimes followed. Women, excluded from political power and most workplaces, had few tools to intervene directly. Alcohol became a tangible enemy, a clear target for reform. Out of this frustration rose some of the most influential organizations of the 19th century. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, transformed temperance from a moral appeal into a disciplined, national movement. The WCTU did not focus solely on alcohol. It addressed domestic violence, child welfare, education, and public health. Alcohol, in their view, was linked to all of it. Their methods were calm, but firm. Women organized marches, prayer vigils, and sit-ins inside saloons. They sang hymns on sidewalks. They knelt in snow and rain, asking owners to close their doors. Their presence was difficult to dismiss. Respectable. Persistent. Unyielding. Temperance also became entwined with a broader push for women's rights. Leaders like Frances Willard argued that women needed the vote to protect their homes. If laws permitted alcohol, then women must have the power to change those laws. In this way, temperance and suffrage grew together, each reinforcing the other. Meanwhile, another organization was learning how to wield power with precision. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893, focused narrowly and ruthlessly on one goal: the elimination of alcohol through legislation. Unlike earlier moral reformers, the League avoided emotional appeals. It embraced political strategy. It targeted lawmakers. It rewarded allies and punished opponents. It was patient, disciplined, and highly effective. The saloon, once a symbol of community, was recast as a political villain. Reformers accused it of breeding crime, exploiting workers, corrupting elections, and undermining American values. These accusations were not entirely unfounded. Many saloons were tied to political machines. They offered favors in exchange for votes. They served as informal party headquarters in immigrant neighborhoods. But the rhetoric often went further. The saloon was portrayed as foreign, un-American, a threat to social order. Immigrant drinking customs were singled out and criticized. Beer gardens, wine with meals, and communal drinking were framed as incompatible with American morality. Temperance, in this sense, became a tool of cultural control as much as moral reform. Scientific language soon joined religious rhetoric. Doctors and educators began to describe alcohol as a poison. Pamphlets warned of physical degeneration. Children were taught in schools that alcohol destroyed the body and mind. These lessons were often exaggerated, sometimes inaccurate, but they were effective. A generation grew up associating drink with danger. By the late 19th century, temperance had hardened into something more absolute. Moderation was no longer enough. Abstinence became the ideal. The idea that society could be purified by removing alcohol altogether gained credibility. Local option laws allowed towns and counties to vote themselves dry. Entire regions stopped legal alcohol sales. The experiment, at least on paper, seemed to work. And yet, opposition remained strong. Brewers, distillers, saloon owners, and workers fought back. Alcohol taxes funded schools and roads. Drinking was deeply ingrained in social life. For many, Temperance felt like intrusion, like moral surveillance, like one group imposing its values on another. The nation stood divided. Churches against taverns, reformers against workers, women against entrenched political machines. Each side believed it was protecting the future of America. As this part draws to a close, imagine a quiet church hall at night. Wooden benches, soft lamplight. A woman stands, holding a pledge card, her voice steady as she speaks of her children and her home. Outside, not far away, a saloon door swings open, laughter spilling into the street. Two worlds coexist for a moment longer. In the hush that follows, we let them rest side by side. And when you are ready, we will move forward into war, nationalism, and the final push that turned moral reform into constitutional law. Part 3. World War I, Nationalism, and the Political Push for a Dry Nation. As we move gently onward, the tone of the nation begins to change. The moral debates of the 19th century do not disappear, but they sharpen. The world grows louder. The pace quickens. And across the ocean, a war begins to pull America toward a decision it has been quietly rehearsing for decades. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States watched from a distance at first. Newspapers carried images of trenches and shattered cities. Ships vanished at sea. Slowly, unease settled into the American imagination. And when the country finally entered the war in 1917, nearly every aspect of public life was reshaped by urgency, fear, and patriotism. Temperance advocates recognized an opening. War required discipline, efficiency, sacrifice. The nation was asked to conserve food, fuel, and labor. Alcohol, long framed as wasteful and weakening, now appeared incompatible with the demands of total war. Reformers argued that grain should feed soldiers, not breweries. Workers, they insisted, needed clear minds to produce weapons and supplies. Drunkenness was recast as not just immoral, but unpatriotic. The language of temperance merged seamlessly with the language of nationalism. Breweries became targets, especially because many of the largest were owned by German Americans. Names like Anheuser and Busch, once symbols of success, were suddenly suspect. Anti-German sentiment surged. German-language newspapers closed. Schools stopped teaching German. Street names were changed. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. Beer, for the first time, felt foreign. Temperance leaders seized this association. They painted the brewing industry as an enemy within, profiting while American soldiers fought overseas. Drinking beer was framed as supporting the Kaiser. This rhetoric, though unfair and often xenophobic, proved effective. It gave moral reform a patriotic mask. At the same time, political power was shifting. The Anti-Saloon League had spent years perfecting its strategy. It did not care about party loyalty. It cared about votes. Any politician who supported temperance received backing. Any who opposed it faced organized opposition. Elections were influenced quietly, district by district. Lawmakers learned that resisting the League could end careers. By the 1910s, many states had already gone dry. Rural regions, where temperance was strongest, held disproportionate political influence. Urban centers, filled with immigrants and saloons, were increasingly portrayed as chaotic and corrupt. The idea that rural moral clarity should guide national policy gained traction. Women's activism also reached a turning point. The suffrage movement and temperance movement had grown together, reinforcing one another. Granting women the vote was framed as a way to protect families from alcohol. Politicians who supported prohibition could also appeal to women reformers, gaining moral legitimacy in the process. Then came the war measures. The federal government passed laws restricting alcohol near military bases. Soldiers were forbidden from drinking. Wartime prohibition of distilled spirits was enacted to conserve resources. These temporary restrictions created a testing ground. Life went on. Factories continued. The sky did not fall. To many reformers, this was proof that permanent prohibition was possible. By 1917, the momentum was unmistakable. The 18th Amendment, proposing a nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, was introduced to Congress. In normal times, such a proposal might have stalled. But these were not normal times. The nation was mobilized. Dissent was discouraged. Unity was prized. Congress passed the amendment in December 1917. The states moved quickly. Ratification, which normally took years, was completed in just 13 months. By January 1919, the amendment was law. The speed was breathtaking. For many Americans, prohibition arrived not as the climax of a long debate, but as a sudden reality. 1 year, alcohol was legal. The next, it was not. There was little time to adjust, little opportunity to resist. Supporters celebrated. Churches rang bells. Reformers declared victory. They believed they had saved the nation from itself. They imagined quieter streets, safer homes, stronger families. Opponents were stunned. Breweries closed almost overnight. Saloons shut their doors. Thousands lost their jobs. Cities lost tax revenue. Drinkers stockpiled alcohol, filling basements and attics with bottles. Others laughed it off, convinced the law would be ignored or repealed. Few truly understood what prohibition would become. The law did not outlaw drinking itself, only the manufacture and sale of alcohol. This distinction mattered. It created loopholes. It encouraged creativity. It invited defiance. The machinery of enforcement was weak. The appetite for alcohol remained strong. As the war ended and soldiers returned home, America stood on the edge of an experiment unlike any it had attempted before. A moral vision had been written into the Constitution. Desire had been criminalized. An entire culture had been told to stop. As we pause at the end of this part, imagine the nation in early 1920. Storefronts shuttered. Signs removed. Bottles hidden. A strange quiet settles over streets that once echoed with song and argument. The law is in place. The ban has begun. And yet, beneath that quiet, something stirs. In the stillness that follows, we let the moment linger. And when you are ready, we will step into the first days of prohibition and see how ordinary people responded when the lights went out and the doors closed. Part 4. The first days of prohibition and how ordinary people reacted. As we drift gently into the next chapter, the calendar turns quietly. January arrives. The year is 1920. There are no parades to mark the moment. No dramatic announcements in the streets. Just a line of law, finally taking effect, and a nation waking up to a change that feels both unreal and deeply personal. At midnight on January 16th, the 18th Amendment became active. With it came the Volstead Act, the legislation that defined what prohibition would actually mean. Alcohol stronger than a modest threshold was now illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport. The law did not forbid drinking itself. It did not order people to pour their bottles down drains. Instead, it removed the legal paths by which alcohol had always moved. In theory, the transition was clean. In reality, it was anything but. Across cities and towns, saloons closed their doors for the last time. Some did so reluctantly, with farewell parties and final rounds served before the clock struck 12. Others transformed themselves overnight, swapping beer taps for soda fountains, whiskey shelves for sandwiches and coffee. Signs were changed. Windows were scrubbed. Names softened. The familiar glow of the saloon dimmed, replaced by something quieter and less certain. Breweries and distilleries faced harsher choices. Many shut down entirely. Some attempted to pivot, producing near beer, malt syrup, or industrial alcohol. Workers were laid off. Families felt the loss immediately. Entire neighborhoods built around brewing industries fell into uneasy silence. For ordinary Americans, the reaction was rarely ideological. It was practical. Some people complied without complaint. Church-going families who had supported temperance saw prohibition as a moral victory. They expected calmer streets, safer homes, fewer broken paychecks. In rural areas already accustomed to dry laws, little seemed to change. Life continued much as it had before. In cities, however, the mood was different. Drinkers did not disappear. They adapted. Basements became social spaces. Backrooms were cleared. A trusted friend knew a trusted friend. Bottles emerged quietly at dinner parties and card games. What had once been public became private. What had been casual became deliberate. Almost immediately, loopholes revealed themselves. Doctors were permitted to prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes. Prescriptions multiplied. Pharmacies became unlikely hubs of legal drinking. Clergy were allowed sacramental wine. Churches expanded their inventories. Households learned to make wine at home, legally, as long as it was not sold. Grape bricks appeared in grocery stores, accompanied by careful warnings about what not to do with them. The law's language invited interpretation, and Americans proved eager interpreters. Enforcement was uneven and underfunded. Federal agents were few. Local police were often indifferent or quietly opposed to the law. Many officers drank themselves. Others saw prohibition as an imposition from distant lawmakers who did not understand their communities. Bribery began almost immediately. A blind eye could be purchased. A delivery could pass unchallenged. What surprised many reformers was how quickly defiance normalized. Drinking did not feel rebellious in a dramatic way. It felt ordinary. People did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as continuing a habit that had been legal their entire lives. The law felt abstract. The desire felt concrete. Speakeasies emerged naturally, not as organized criminal enterprises at first, but as informal gathering places. A door without a sign. A password shared quietly. Inside, the atmosphere was familiar. Music played softly. Glasses clinked. Conversation flowed. The act of entering carried a thrill, but once inside, it felt like home. For women, the change was striking. Saloons had largely been male spaces. Speakeasies welcomed everyone. Couples went out together. Women drank publicly in ways they rarely had before. Prohibition, intended to enforce morality, unintentionally reshaped social norms. Meanwhile, the law began to reveal its contradictions. Public drunkenness decreased in some areas, but dangerous alcohol increased. Without regulation, quality vanished. Poorly distilled liquor poisoned drinkers. Headlines reported blindness and death. Reformers blamed drinkers. Drinkers blamed the law. Organized crime, still fragmented, began to notice opportunity. Supplying alcohol was illegal, but demand was enormous. Small-scale bootleggers moved bottles by car and boat. Smugglers tested borders. Corruption spread gently, transaction by transaction. Yet in these first days, most Americans were not thinking about gangsters or empires. They were thinking about dinner, about celebrations, about whether the law would truly last. Many believed prohibition was temporary. A phase. A moral experiment that would be quietly abandoned once its flaws became obvious. Others believed the opposite. They saw early compliance as proof that society could be reshaped. That desire could be disciplined. That law could mold behavior. Between these beliefs, daily life continued. As this part comes to a close, imagine a city street at night in early 1920. Officially, it is dry. The signs say so. The law insists. And yet, behind a darkened door, laughter drifts out softly. A glass is raised. A toast is whispered. The nation has entered prohibition. But it has not stopped drinking. In the calm that follows, we let that contradiction rest. And when you are ready, we will move into immigrant Brooklyn, into crowded streets and early gangs, and into the beginnings of a young man named Al Capone. Part 5. Immigrant Brooklyn, Gangs, and Capone's Early Psychology. As we move gently into the next part of our story, we leave the hush of newly dry streets and travel backward in time and eastward in space, to a different kind of neighborhood. Before Chicago. Before Prohibition's fortunes. Before the name Capone carried weight. We arrive in Brooklyn, at the turn of the century, where crowded streets and restless energy shaped a boy who would one day learn how power truly worked. Alphonse Capone was born in 1899 in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Navy Yard, the fourth of 9 children in a family of Italian immigrants. His parents had crossed the Atlantic seeking stability, not wealth. His father was a barber. His mother, deeply religious, held the household together with discipline and devotion. Like many immigrant families, they lived tightly packed, surrounded by others who spoke the same language, shared the same foods, and carried the same memories of home. Brooklyn at this time was alive and compressed. Tenements rose shoulder to shoulder. Children filled the streets. Pushcarts rattled over uneven pavement. The air carried the scent of coal smoke, food, and the nearby harbor. Work was hard to find and easy to lose. Opportunity and frustration lived side by side. For young boys growing up here, the street was a classroom. School existed, but it often felt secondary. Many children left early to help support their families. Respect was earned quickly and lost faster. Insults could turn physical in moments. Loyalty mattered. Reputation mattered more. Violence was not extraordinary. It was practical. Capone was a large boy, even young, with a quick temper and a sharp awareness of status. He was not unintelligent, but formal education held little appeal. At 14, he was expelled from school after striking a teacher. The incident mattered less for its details than for what followed. Capone did not return. The street had claimed him fully. Gangs offered structure where institutions did not. Brooklyn was dotted with them, loose groups of boys and young men organized by neighborhood, ethnicity, or ambition. They provided protection, income, and identity. To belong was to survive. Capone gravitated toward these circles naturally. He learned early how to project toughness, how to respond to slights, how to assert presence without always resorting to force. Violence was a tool, but not the only one. Charisma mattered. Humor mattered. Being useful mattered. He found his way to Frankie Yale. Yale was a local gangster with a gift for image. He ran saloons and clubs, but he also understood branding before the word existed. He dressed sharply. He cultivated fear and admiration in equal measure. Under Yale's influence, Capone learned lessons that would stay with him for life. Violence should be decisive, not constant. Reputation could do as much work as fists. Appearances mattered. One incident would mark Capone permanently. While working at one of Yale's establishments, he insulted a woman. Her brother slashed Capone's face with a knife, leaving scars that would earn him the nickname Scarface. Capone despised the name. The scars were reminders, not of toughness, but of vulnerability. They taught him restraint. Words could provoke consequences as real as blows. Brooklyn gangs at this time were not sophisticated criminal organizations. They were opportunistic, fluid, often chaotic. Yet within that chaos, Capone learned patterns. He observed how money moved, how fear traveled, how loyalty could be purchased or broken. He learned that the most dangerous people were not always the loudest. Psychologically, Capone absorbed the logic of his environment. The world was unstable. Authority was unreliable. Survival depended on alliances and strength. Compassion existed, but it was selective. Family loyalty was sacred. Outsiders were suspect. He also developed a deep aversion to humiliation. Respect, once lost, was difficult to regain. This fear would later shape his public persona. He would give generously, laugh loudly, appear approachable, all while guarding his authority fiercely. By his late teens, Brooklyn began to feel small. Opportunity was limited. Competition was fierce. Prohibition, still approaching, was already reshaping criminal possibilities elsewhere. Chicago, with its booming industry, fractured politics, and thirsty population, beckoned. When Johnny Torrio, another Italian-American gangster with a more disciplined approach, invited Capone west, it felt less like a risk and more like a release. Brooklyn had taught Capone how to survive. Chicago, he sensed, would teach him how to rule. As this part settles, imagine the young Capone standing on a Brooklyn street at dusk. The harbor lights flicker. The noise of the city hums around him. He is not yet powerful, not yet famous, but he is already shaped. The lessons are in place. In the quiet that follows, we let that boy linger for a moment longer. And when you are ready, we will step into Coney Island, into violence and spectacle, and into the image-making that refined Capone's path forward. Part 6. Frankie Yale. Coney Island, violence, and image making. As we drift onward, the neighborhood widens. The tight residential streets of Brooklyn give way to something louder, brighter, and more theatrical. We arrive at Coney Island, a place of lights and noise, of music and crowds, where pleasure was sold openly and danger hid just beneath the surface. It was here, under the glow of amusement rides and seaside bars, that Al Capone learned how violence and image could be woven together into something far more powerful than brute force alone. Coney Island at the turn of the century was a world apart. It was escape made physical. Working-class families came to forget the grind of factory life. Tourists wandered through carnivals and dance halls. Alcohol flowed freely. Rules softened. Identities blurred. For men like Frankie Yale, this was ideal terrain. Yale understood spectacle. He ran saloons, dance halls, and gambling operations, but he also curated his own legend. He dressed impeccably. He surrounded himself with tough men who looked the part. Violence, when it happened, was public enough to be remembered, but controlled enough to avoid chaos. Fear was not accidental. It was cultivated. Capone became part of Yale's world in his late teens. He worked as a bartender, a bouncer, a collector. These roles were not glamorous, but they were educational. Standing at doors taught him how to read people quickly. Who was nervous? Who was dangerous? Who could be intimidated? Collecting debts taught him tone. A threat could be whispered or shouted. The choice mattered. Coney Island also taught Capone that violence was a performance. When fights broke out, they happened where they could be seen. When someone crossed a line, the response was swift and memorable. The goal was not endless conflict. It was demonstration. One decisive act could prevent dozens of challenges. Reputation did the rest. Capone watched carefully. He learned that looking powerful was often as important as being powerful. A man who appeared calm in chaos commanded attention. A man who dressed well, who laughed easily, who paid for drinks, felt untouchable. Fear wrapped in charm was far more effective than fear alone. Yet the violence was real, and Capone did not shy away from it. He participated in assaults. He enforced Yale's authority. He learned how to act without hesitation when ordered. This did not make him reckless. It made him reliable. In a world where trust was scarce, reliability was valuable. The scar on his face remained a constant reminder. Capone avoided provoking unnecessary confrontations. He learned to control his temper publicly, even if it burned privately. He understood that words could escalate situations unpredictably. Silence, often, was safer. Coney Island also exposed Capone to a wider criminal network. Sailors, smugglers, gamblers, and thieves passed through nightly. Information flowed as freely as liquor. Capone listened. He absorbed stories of other cities, other operations. He heard Chicago mentioned often. A city larger, rougher, and less settled. A city where politics and crime overlapped openly. Frankie Yale played a crucial role in Capone's development, but he also represented a limit. Yale thrived on visibility. He enjoyed being feared. He enjoyed being known. Capone, watching closely, began to sense the danger in this. Too much attention invited retaliation. It invited police focus. It shortened careers. Capone's psychology continued to evolve. He was ambitious, but not impulsive. He wanted security as much as power. Stability mattered. Yale's world was exciting, but unstable. Violence solved problems quickly, but created new ones just as fast. When Johnny Torrio reached out, offering an opportunity in Chicago, Capone recognized a shift in direction. Torrio was different from Yale. He favored planning over impulse, negotiation over spectacle. He believed in systems, not just intimidation. Leaving Brooklyn and Coney Island was not an act of betrayal. It was progression. Capone took with him the lessons Yale had taught him, but he was ready to refine them, to apply them in a larger arena. As this part comes to rest, imagine Coney Island at night. Music drifts from dance halls. Lights shimmer over dark water. In the crowd, a young Capone moves with ease, confident, observant, already thinking beyond the boardwalk. In the stillness that follows, we let the lights fade. And when you are ready, we will travel west, into Chicago, into Torrio's disciplined system, and into the restraint that transformed ambition into empire. Part 7. Moving to Chicago, Torrio's system, and learning restraint. As we move softly onward, the sea air of Coney Island fades behind us, replaced by the deeper, heavier rhythm of the American Midwest. The train carries us west, away from the Atlantic, toward a city built on industry, ambition, and contradiction. Chicago rises from the flat landscape like a machine in motion, its smokestacks and rail yards humming day and night. This is where Al Capone will learn his most important lesson of all. Restraint. When Capone arrived in Chicago in the late 1910s, he was still young, still forming, still dangerous but unpolished. The city he entered was rough, but it was also organized in a way Brooklyn had not been. Power here was structured. Neighborhoods were controlled. Politics and crime were entwined openly. Violence existed, but it followed patterns. At the center of this system stood Johnny Torrio. Torrio was older, calmer, and deliberate. Where Frankie Yale enjoyed spectacle, Torrio preferred silence. He dressed neatly, spoke softly, and avoided attention. He believed that force should be used only when negotiation failed, and even then, quickly and decisively. Torrio ran Chicago's criminal operations like a business, not a gang. Capone immediately recognized the difference. Under Torrio, Capone was not encouraged to prove himself through constant aggression. Instead, he was asked to observe, to manage, to think. Torrio placed him in charge of protecting brothels, collecting payments, and resolving disputes. Capone learned how to speak with rival operators without escalating conflict. He learned how to balance threats with offers. This was new terrain. Chicago's underworld was deeply connected to politics. Ward bosses controlled votes. Police commanders were loyal to elected officials. Torrio understood that stability required cooperation, not domination. He paid officials regularly. He avoided unnecessary confrontations. He maintained relationships. Capone watched closely. He absorbed the lesson that corruption, when routine, was quieter than violence. A bribe, repeated monthly, attracted far less attention than a gunshot. Power, Torrio taught him, worked best when it felt invisible. Capone also learned to manage men. Chicago's gangs were larger and more diverse than those in Brooklyn. They included Irish, Italian, and other ethnic groups, each with their own territories and traditions. Torrio insisted on discipline. Men who acted impulsively endangered everyone. Loyalty was rewarded. Recklessness was punished. Capone, once hot-tempered, adapted. He learned to listen. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent. He learned that patience could produce more profit than force. This did not soften him. It sharpened him. Prohibition was approaching, and Torrio understood its potential immediately. He did not see it as moral reform. He saw it as an economic shift. Alcohol would not disappear. It would move underground. Whoever controlled supply and distribution would control enormous wealth. Torrio began preparing before the law even took effect. Capone was tasked with execution. He oversaw logistics, security, and enforcement. He learned how to move goods quietly, how to establish routes, how to maintain relationships with suppliers and distributors. He learned that scale mattered, that consistency mattered. When Prohibition began in 1920, Torrio's organization was ready. While smaller operators scrambled, Torrio's network functioned smoothly. Speakeasies were supplied. Police were paid. Rivals were negotiated with or pushed aside methodically. Violence was minimal, not because Torrio was weak, but because he was strategic. Capone thrived in this environment. His natural charisma made him effective with both subordinates and associates. He could intimidate when necessary, but he could also charm. He hosted gatherings. He paid generously. He cultivated loyalty not just through fear, but through benefit. Yet Torrio remained cautious. He warned Capone against visibility, against unnecessary flamboyance, against personal vendettas. Capone listened, mostly, but his personality pulled him toward the public eye. He enjoyed being known. He enjoyed the sense of importance. Torrio saw this as a risk. Their partnership would soon be tested. As this part settles, imagine Chicago at night in the early 1920s. Streetcars glide past brick buildings. Inside unmarked doors, glasses are raised quietly. The system is working. Money flows steadily. Violence is restrained. In the stillness that follows, we let that balance hold for just a moment longer. And when you are ready, we will step deeper into Prohibition's economics, into bootlegging on an industrial scale, and into the foundations of an empire. Part 8. Prohibition Economics and the Birth of Organized Bootlegging. As we drift into the next chapter, the machinery beneath Prohibition begins to hum more audibly. The law has settled into place, and with it comes a realization that spreads quietly across the nation. Drinking has not stopped. It has simply changed form. What was once legal commerce has become forbidden trade, and in that transformation, an entirely new economy is born. Prohibition did not eliminate demand. It concentrated it. Millions of Americans still wanted alcohol. They wanted it for celebration, for comfort, for habit. The Volstead Act had closed breweries and saloons, but it had not closed desire. In economic terms, Prohibition created a perfect storm. High demand, restricted supply, enormous profit potential. Johnny Torrio understood this immediately, and under his guidance, Chicago became a laboratory for organized bootlegging. Early bootlegging was small-scale. Individuals made liquor at home or smuggled bottles across short distances. But this approach could not satisfy urban demand. Speakeasies multiplied rapidly, and each required steady, reliable supply. Sporadic deliveries were not enough. Consistency became the key. To provide consistency, bootlegging had to be organized. Torrio and his associates began by securing sources. Industrial alcohol, legally produced for manufacturing and medical use, could be diverted and redistilled. Grain alcohol could be produced secretly in large quantities. Supply chains formed quietly, linking producers to distributors to retailers. Capone played a central role in turning these chains into systems. He helped coordinate production sites, transportation routes, and storage locations. He learned how to stagger shipments to avoid detection, how to move goods at night, how to disguise trucks, how to pay drivers well enough to ensure silence. Bootlegging, under Torrio and Capone, began to resemble legitimate business operations, complete with schedules, payrolls, and risk management. Distribution required cooperation. Speakeasies were not independent rebels. They were clients. They paid for protection, for steady supply, for reliability. Prices were negotiated. Territories were respected. In exchange, operators received consistent deliveries and relative safety from police interference. Corruption greased every step. Police officers were bribed to ignore shipments. Inspectors were paid to look away. Judges received quiet gifts. The money flowed upward and outward, binding the system together. Prohibition enforcement agencies were underfunded and understaffed. Many agents were tempted. Others were overwhelmed. A law without enforcement teeth became a negotiation. As profits grew, so did competition. Rival gangs recognized the same opportunity. Irish and Italian organizations vied for territory. Disputes arose over routes, suppliers, and customers. Torrio's approach was to negotiate first. Violence, he believed, should be a last resort. Capone adopted this philosophy publicly, even as he prepared for escalation. Bootlegging economics rewarded scale. The more territory an organization controlled, the lower its costs and the higher its margins. This encouraged consolidation. Smaller operators were absorbed or pushed out. Agreements were made. Boundaries drawn. Chicago's underworld began to organize itself around alcohol. Capone's charisma proved invaluable. He could smooth negotiations. He could threaten when necessary. He could entertain rivals and allies alike. His presence reassured partners and intimidated competitors. He became the face of operations, even as Torrio remained the strategist. The social impact of bootlegging was profound. Speakeasies became cultural hubs. Jazz flourished. Social barriers softened. Women and men drank together. Nightlife thrived in defiance of the law. The very act of drinking became exciting, transgressive, modern. Prohibition unintentionally created a culture of rebellion that fed demand further. Yet beneath the glamour, danger accumulated. Unregulated alcohol varied wildly in quality. Poisonings occurred. Violence simmered beneath negotiated peace. As money flowed, so did ambition. The system, though efficient, was fragile. In 1925, an assassination attempt on Torrio would change everything. Torrio survived, but the message was clear. Violence was escalating. The balance was tipping. Torrio, weary and cautious, decided to step back. Leadership passed to Capone. As this part settles, imagine Chicago at its threshold. Money moves through hidden channels. Speakeasies glow behind unmarked doors. Power consolidates quietly. The machinery is built. In the stillness that follows, we let that machinery rest just before it accelerates. And when you are ready, we will step into the nightlife itself, into jazz-filled rooms and crowded dance floors, and into the social world that flourished under Capone's empire. Part 9. Chicago nightlife, speakeasies, jazz, and social life. As we move gently onward, the machinery of bootlegging fades into the background and another world comes into focus. This is the world most people remember when they think of Prohibition Chicago. Not the ledgers or the trucks or the negotiations, but the rooms behind closed doors. The glow. The music. The feeling that something forbidden was happening, and that it was happening everywhere. Chicago at night during the early 1920s felt alive in a new way. Speakeasies appeared in basements, back rooms, apartments, hotels, and storefronts that gave no hint of what waited inside. Some were small and quiet, little more than a table and a phonograph. Others were grand, filled with chandeliers, polished bars, and dance floors crowded until dawn. A visitor might knock, whisper a password, and be ushered into warmth, light, and sound. Inside, the law felt very far away. Alcohol flowed freely, though not always smoothly. Drinks were strong, sometimes harsh, sometimes sweetened to mask poor quality. Glasses clinked. Cigarette smoke curled toward low ceilings. Conversations overlapped. The mood was social, conspiratorial, intimate. Everyone inside shared a secret, even if that secret was widely known. Jazz provided the heartbeat. Musicians arrived from New Orleans, bringing with them a sound that felt restless and modern. Trumpets blared softly or sharply depending on the hour. Pianos rolled. Drums whispered and snapped. Jazz was improvisational, expressive, and unpredictable, much like the era itself. It suited speakeasies perfectly. The music filled gaps in conversation and carried emotion without explanation. For many white patrons, jazz felt thrilling and exotic. For black musicians and audiences, it was familiar and vital, though often segregated and underpaid. Chicago's South Side became a center of black nightlife, with clubs that pulsed until morning. These spaces offered freedom and creativity even as racial boundaries remained firmly in place. Prohibition reshaped social norms in unexpected ways. Before the ban, respectable women rarely entered saloons. Speakeasies changed that. Because they were hidden and selective, they felt safer, more refined. Couples went out together. Women drank publicly. Fashion followed. Dresses shortened. Hairstyles changed. Social rules loosened. Drinking became a symbol of modern identity. To drink was to reject old restraints. It was to participate in the new urban culture. Prohibition, intended to enforce morality, instead made alcohol fashionable. Young people, especially, embraced it as a form of quiet rebellion against authority they did not respect. Capone understood this world instinctively. Though he was deeply involved in the logistics of alcohol distribution, he also recognized the power of atmosphere. His organization supplied many of Chicago's most successful speakeasies. He invested in places that felt luxurious and welcoming. He knew that customers who felt safe and entertained were loyal customers. Capone cultivated an image that fit the nightlife perfectly. He dressed well. He smiled easily. He tipped generously. He was visible, approachable, and memorable. Patrons saw him as a host rather than a criminal. He laughed with musicians. He bought drinks. He appeared relaxed, even jovial. This public presence helped humanize him in the eyes of many Chicagoans. Violence existed, but it was kept out of sight whenever possible. Shootings did not belong inside speakeasies. They disrupted business. Capone preferred order. Problems were handled elsewhere. Quiet warnings were issued. Debts were collected privately. The illusion of safety was carefully maintained. For ordinary people, the nightlife offered escape. The early 1920s were a time of adjustment. The war had ended. The economy was shifting. Cities were growing fast. Traditional structures felt distant. Speakeasies offered connection, excitement, and release. They allowed people to forget the law for a few hours and focus on the moment. Yet beneath the surface glamour, the system relied on constant negotiation. Police raids happened occasionally, often tipped off in advance. A club might close for a night, then reopen under a new name. Payments were adjusted. Relationships maintained. The law became part of the rhythm, another obstacle to be managed rather than a force to be obeyed. Capone's influence grew steadily through this social web. He was not just a supplier. He was a facilitator of pleasure. He helped create the spaces where Chicago relaxed, danced, and drank. This earned him a measure of public tolerance. Many people knew who he was. Fewer cared enough to object. Journalists began to take notice. Capone was quoted in newspapers. He spoke openly, sometimes carelessly, about Prohibition's hypocrisy. He framed himself as a businessman meeting public demand. His willingness to speak gave him visibility, and visibility brought both admiration and scrutiny. Still, in these years, the nightlife flourished. Chicago nights glowed with possibility. Music spilled into alleys. Laughter echoed down stairwells. The law hovered at the edges but rarely intruded fully. It felt, to many, like a golden moment, fragile and fleeting. As this part comes to rest, imagine a speakeasy just before closing. The music softens. Glasses are cleared. Couples linger. Outside, dawn approaches quietly, unaware of what the night has held. In the calm that follows, we let the music fade. And when you are ready, we will follow the bottles themselves, tracing the smuggling routes that fed this nightlife, across lakes, borders, and darkened roads. Part 10. Smuggling routes, Canada, the Great Lakes, and logistics. As we move softly onward, we step out of the speakeasy and into the cold night air. The music fades behind us, replaced by wind, water, and distance. To understand how Chicago's nightlife survived night after night, we must follow the bottles themselves, tracing the quiet paths that carried alcohol from source to glass. Prohibition did not erase geography. In fact, it made geography more important than ever. Chicago's location was ideal. The city sat at the heart of the Great Lakes, connected by water to Canada and by rail and road to the rest of the country. These routes had been built for commerce long before Prohibition. Now they served a different kind of trade. Canada was central to the operation. Alcohol was legal there. Distilleries in Ontario and Quebec continued producing whiskey, rum, and other spirits openly. Exporting alcohol was legal as well. The crime occurred only once the liquor crossed into the United States. This legal gray space created opportunity. Liquor left Canadian ports labeled for export. Ships sailed across the lakes under cover of night or in plain sight. Some hovered just beyond American waters, floating warehouses waiting for smaller boats. Others docked in remote inlets. The water, vast and dark, was difficult to police effectively. Smugglers adapted quickly. During winter, when lakes froze, the ice became a highway. Trucks and sleds crossed frozen expanses carrying crates of liquor. Drivers memorized routes, avoiding pressure cracks and weak spots. The cold was dangerous, but predictable. Law enforcement was slower, less prepared. In warmer months, speed mattered. Fast boats outran patrols. Crews learned the habits of Coast Guard vessels. They moved in fog. They moved at night. They used coded signals and lookout posts. Smuggling became a skill passed down through experience. Once liquor reached American shores, another network took over. Trucks carried shipments into Chicago, often hidden beneath legitimate cargo. False compartments were built into vehicles. Drivers used rotating routes. Warehouses near the city stored supplies temporarily before distribution. Timing was carefully managed to avoid accumulation that might draw attention. Capone's organization excelled at this logistics. Under his leadership, routes were standardized. Redundancies were built in. If one path failed, another was ready. Losses were anticipated and absorbed as part of business. The goal was not perfection, but continuity. Protection followed the bottles. Bribes ensured that certain roads remained unpatrolled. Informants provided warnings of raids. Schedules shifted in response to rumors. The system was dynamic, constantly adjusting to pressure. Smuggling was not limited to alcohol. The same routes carried other goods. Weapons. Money. Information. Relationships formed between smugglers and suppliers that extended beyond prohibition itself. These networks would outlast the law, shaping organized crime for decades. The human element was essential. Smugglers were not faceless criminals. They were sailors, drivers, laborious, many drawn by steady pay in uncertain times. Some saw themselves as providing a service. Others simply needed work. The risk was high, but so were the rewards. Violence was present, but not constant. Most shipments moved without incident. When conflicts occurred, they were often about territory or betrayal rather than law enforcement. Trust mattered. A single informant could unravel an entire route. Capone understood this. He rewarded loyalty generously and punished betrayal decisively. This created stability. People stayed quiet because it benefited them to do so. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace. The Coast Guard was underfunded. Federal agents were few. Jurisdictional confusion slowed responses. State, local, and federal authorities often failed to coordinate. Smugglers exploited these gaps expertly. Public opinion further weakened enforcement. Many Americans viewed smuggling as harmless or even admirable. Rum runners were romanticized in newspapers and stories. The law felt distant. The smugglers felt familiar. As profits increased, smuggling operations grew more sophisticated. Ships were purchased specifically for speed and concealment. Communication systems improved. Bribery budgets expanded. What had begun as improvisation evolved into infrastructure. Chicago became a hub. Liquor arriving through the Great Lakes did not stop in the city. It flowed outward to other regions, feeding demand across the Midwest. Chicago's centrality amplified its power. As this part comes to rest, imagine a small boat cutting across dark water, its engine muffled, its crew alert. Crates shift quietly. Above, the sky is wide and indifferent. Below, the lake hides secrets willingly. In the calm that follows, we let the water still. And when you are ready, we will turn inward, towards city halls and police stations, and explore how politics and corruption sustain this underground world. Part 11. Politics, police corruption, and municipal power. As we drift gently onward, we leave the cold openness of the lakes and return to the city itself. Brick buildings rise again. Streets intersect in neat grids. Inside offices and council chambers, another current flows, quieter than smuggling boats, but just as powerful. This is where Prohibition truly faltered. Not on the water, but in the machinery of local government. Chicago in the 1920s was a city governed as much by relationships as by laws. Political power was fragmented and deeply local. Ward bosses controlled neighborhoods. They delivered votes, favors, and protection. In return, they received loyalty and influence. This system had existed long before Prohibition, but the ban magnified its importance. Alcohol became currency. Speakeasies needed protection. Protection required cooperation. Cooperation required payments. Bribes moved through familiar channels, folded into the existing structure of political machines. The system did not feel criminal to many involved. It felt like business as usual. Police officers were central to this arrangement. Prohibition enforcement was often assigned to local departments already stretched thin. Officers were poorly paid and faced daily temptation. Turning a blind eye could double a salary. Looking the other way became routine. Some officers drank openly while enforcing the law. Others warned speakeasy owners of upcoming raids. A raid itself might be staged, meant to satisfy public pressure without disrupting operations. Bottles would be seized, then quietly returned. Fines would be paid and forgotten. Capone's organization understood these dynamics intimately. Payments were systematic, not sporadic. Police commanders received regular envelopes. Patrol routes were known. Certain streets remained safe corridors. This predictability allowed business to flourish. Judges and prosecutors were not immune. Cases disappeared. Evidence went missing. Charges were reduced or dropped. The courts became another negotiation point. Justice was flexible, responsive to influence. Politicians benefited as well. Campaigns were expensive. Capone's money helped fund them. In return, officials ensured favorable appointments and minimal interference. Publicly, they condemned crime. Privately, they cooperated. The mayor's office became a symbol of this uneasy alliance. William Hale Thompson, Chicago's mayor during much of Capone's rise, cultivated a populist image. He criticized prohibition enforcement and federal interference. He framed himself as a defender of local autonomy. While he denied direct ties to Capone, the atmosphere he fostered allowed organized crime to operate with relative freedom. Federal authorities watched with frustration. The Constitution had mandated prohibition, but enforcement relied heavily on local cooperation. When that cooperation failed, the law became symbolic rather than effective. Federal agents lacked manpower and local knowledge. They were outsiders, resented and resisted. Public opinion often sided against them. Many Chicagoans saw prohibition as hypocritical and unenforceable. Corruption felt preferable to intrusion. The law's moral authority eroded further with every visible bribe. Capone navigated this world with skill. He avoided direct involvement in politics publicly, preferring intermediaries. He maintained plausible distance while ensuring influence. His generosity extended beyond bribes. He funded community projects. He donated to charities. He built goodwill that softened his image. Violence, again, was restrained. Killing a police officer or a politician brought unwanted attention. Capone understood boundaries. His power depended on cooperation, not domination. Yet the system was inherently unstable. As money increased, so did scrutiny. Journalists investigated. Reformers protested. Federal officials grew impatient. The very corruption that protected Capone also made him visible. The balance could not hold forever. As this part settles, imagine a police station late at night. Papers shuffled. Phones ring softly. Outside, a speakeasy hums undisturbed. Inside, decisions are made quietly, not about justice, but about convenience. In the stillness that follows, we let that machinery pause. And when you are ready, we will turn to the violence that eventually broke the balance, as gang wars escalated and restraint gave way to bloodshed. Part 12. Gang wars, escalation, and daily violence. As we move gently onward, the careful balance that once defined Chicago's underworld begins to strain. The quiet agreements, the predictable bribes, the negotiated boundaries all start to fray at the edges. Money continues to pour in, but with it comes ambition, resentment, and fear. Violence, once restrained, begins to surface more often, no longer exceptional but increasingly routine. Prohibition had created enormous wealth, but it had also concentrated power. In Chicago, rival organizations competed for the same territories, the same customers, the same smuggling routes. Torrio's earlier philosophy of negotiation still influenced Capone, but not all rivals shared that patience. Younger gang leaders saw violence as a faster path to dominance. The most significant rivalry emerged on the city's north side. The North Side Gang, initially led by Dino Banyan and later by others, controlled territories rich in speakeasies and smuggling access. O'Banion was charismatic, unpredictable, and openly hostile to Capone's organization. He challenged agreements, insulted rivals, and disrupted business. Tensions escalated steadily. Assassinations replaced negotiations. Ambushes occurred in broad daylight. Men were shot outside flower shops, restaurants, and homes. Each killing demanded retaliation. The cycle fed itself. Capone's response was calculated, but firm. He expanded his enforcement teams. He hired men known for reliability under pressure. These were not impulsive street fighters. They were professionals in the grim sense of the word. Violence was planned, rehearsed, and executed quickly. Machine guns entered the picture. The use of automatic weapons changed everything. Drive-by shootings became possible. Cars became weapons. Streets turned into battlegrounds briefly, then returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. The contrast was jarring. For ordinary citizens, violence became background noise. Gunfire echoed occasionally at night. Newspapers reported murders with unsettling regularity. Names blurred together. The city adapted in small ways. People avoided certain streets. They learned to step aside when unfamiliar cars slowed. Life continued. Capone remained publicly affable. He did not hide, but he did not flaunt violence either. He denied involvement. He framed conflicts as misunderstandings between independent groups. His public persona stayed intact even as blood was spilled quietly on his behalf. Inside his organization, discipline tightened. Mistakes were punished. Informants were eliminated. Loyalty was tested constantly. Capone understood that fear, once unleashed, had to be controlled carefully. Too much violence threatened business. Too little invited challenge. The North Side gang proved resilient. Leadership changes did not end the conflict. New leaders emerged, each more aggressive than the last. Agreements collapsed. Retaliations accelerated. The balance that Torrio had built was gone. Law enforcement grew alarmed. The scale of violence could not be ignored. Public pressure mounted. Editorials demanded action. Federal officials took renewed interest. Chicago's reputation suffered nationally. Yet enforcement remained inconsistent. Corruption still protected many operations. Arrests were rare. Convictions rarer. The violence existed in a gray zone, acknowledged but not confronted fully. Capone himself was nearly assassinated during this period. Riddled with bullets outside a restaurant, he survived through luck and medical care. The attack reinforced his belief in decisive action. Hesitation, he concluded, was dangerous. The war demanded a turning point. Capone's organization prepared for a move that would shock the city and alter the course of the conflict. It would be precise. It would be symbolic. It would send a message that could not be ignored. As this part settles, imagine Chicago in winter. Snow dull sound. Streets appear calm. Beneath the surface, plans form quietly. Men wait. The air feels heavy with anticipation. In the stillness that follows, we let that tension rest. And when you are ready, we will step into Capone's strange dual role as both villain and benefactor, and then into the event that marked the beginning of the end. Part 13. Capone as celebrity, charity, and public manipulation. As we drift gently onward, the sound of gunfire fades into the distance, replaced by something more confusing, more unsettling. It is the sound of applause, of laughter, of camera shutters clicking softly. For as violence intensified beneath the surface of Chicago, Al Capone was becoming something entirely unexpected in public view. A celebrity. This transformation did not happen by accident. Capone understood instinctively that power did not rest solely in fear. Fear created obedience, but it also created enemies. Popularity, on the other hand, created protection. If the public tolerated him, or even admired him, authorities would move more carefully. If journalists found him charming, their words might soften. If ordinary people benefited from his generosity, they might look away. Capone began to cultivate this image deliberately. He dressed impeccably, favoring tailored suits, silk ties, and polished shoes. He smiled easily in public. He spoke to reporters willingly, even eagerly. While most gang leaders hid, Capone posed. He framed himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman filling a gap left by a misguided law. He joked. He shrugged. He appeared relaxed. Newspapers were fascinated. Here was a man openly associated with violence and illegal liquor, yet walking freely through hotel lobbies, dining at restaurants, greeting acquaintances with warmth. Reporters quoted him frequently. He complained about Prohibition's hypocrisy. He claimed he was providing a service people wanted. He never admitted to ordering violence, always distancing himself from specific acts. The public listened. Many Chicagoans did not see Capone as a monster. They saw him as a symbol of the era's contradictions. The law said no. Reality said yes. Capone stood where those two collided. In a strange way, he embodied the city's defiance. Then there was the charity. During the early years of the Great Depression, Capone opened soup kitchens in Chicago. These were not small gestures. They fed thousands daily. Men out of work stood in long lines, bowls in hand, grateful. No questions were asked. No loyalty demanded openly. Hunger was answered. The gesture was calculated, but it was also effective. Photographs appeared in newspapers showing the lines, the meals, the relief. Capone's name was attached to generosity, not just crime. For families struggling to survive, moral arguments felt distant. A warm meal mattered more than legality. Capone also supported local businesses, entertainers, and politicians quietly. He paid hospital bills. He tipped extravagantly. He rewarded loyalty not only with protection, but with tangible benefit. His organization became a source of stability in an unstable time. Psychologically, this duality suited him. Capone needed to be feared by rivals, but liked by the public. He enjoyed admiration. He enjoyed being recognized. Yet beneath that charm was a deep sensitivity to disrespect. He could laugh publicly and order violence privately without apparent contradiction. This split persona confused authorities. How do you pursue a man whom much of the city does not actively oppose? How do you rally public support against someone who feeds the hungry and speaks casually with reporters? Capone's visibility was both his shield and his weakness. The manipulation extended to language itself. Capone avoided gangster slang in public. He spoke in business terms. He referred to his operations as enterprises. He framed violence as the result of disputes beyond his control. This distancing allowed many to believe what they wanted to believe. Journalists, eager for access, often obliged. They enjoyed his quotes. They enjoyed his openness. Some even enjoyed his company. Articles sometimes portrayed him as a colorful rogue rather than a ruthless criminal. The myth grew quietly. At the same time, Capone's health began to show strain. Years of heavy drinking, stress, and untreated illness took their toll. His temper flared more easily in private. He became more paranoid. Trust narrowed. The charm remained outwardly intact, but the pressure beneath it increased. Federal authorities grew increasingly uncomfortable. Capone's fame embarrassed the government. The 18th Amendment was supposed to restore morality. Instead, it had produced a folk figure who mocked the law openly. His very existence challenged the legitimacy of prohibition. Efforts to prosecute him for violence failed repeatedly. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Corruption intervened. Capone's insulation seemed complete. And yet, his public prominence ensured scrutiny would not fade. The more visible he became, the more pressure mounted for decisive action. Editorials shifted tone. Reformers demanded accountability. The federal government began to look beyond violence, beyond alcohol itself. Quietly, a different approach formed. If Capone could not be taken down for murder, perhaps he could be taken down for something more mundane. Something less dramatic. Something harder to evade. Taxes. As this part settles, imagine Capone standing in front of cameras, smiling broadly, his suit immaculate. Behind him, the city churns. Speakeasies glow. Soup lines stretch. Violence simmers. Two images coexist. In the calm that follows, we let that contradiction rest. And when you are ready, we will step into the event that shattered Capone's careful balance and marked the turning point from empire to collapse. Part 14. The St. Valentine's Day context, aftermath, and turning point. As we drift into the next chapter, the rhythm of the story slows, as if the city itself senses what is coming. Winter has settled over Chicago. Snow dulls the streets. Breath hangs in the air. The violence that once erupted sporadically now feels inevitable, like a storm that has been building quietly beyond the horizon. By early 1929, the war between Capone's organization and the North Side Gang had reached a breaking point. Years of retaliation had hardened everyone involved. Trust was gone. Agreements meant little. Each side believed the other incapable of restraint. The North Side Gang, now led by George "Bugs" Moran, remained Capone's most persistent challenge. Moran disrupted shipments. He mocked Capone publicly. He refused to submit. Capone, for his part, felt cornered. His empire was vast, but unstable. Violence threatened business. Federal attention was growing. Rivals sensed weakness in prolonged conflict. The old balance Torrio had once preserved was gone, replaced by exhaustion and paranoia. Something decisive, Capone believed, was required. The plan that formed was chilling in its simplicity. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 men associated with the North Side Gang were gathered in a garage on North Clark Street. They believed they were receiving a shipment of hijacked liquor. The meeting seemed routine. No alarm bells rang. Trust, however thin, still existed. What followed shocked the nation. Men dressed as police officers entered the garage. The gang members, accustomed to staged raids and bribed enforcement, did not resist. They lined up against the wall. Then the shooting began. Machine guns roared. Pistols fired. The sound echoed briefly, then stopped. 7 men lay dead. The brutality of the event was unprecedented. Violence had been part of Prohibition, but this felt different. Organized. Methodical. Public. Photographs spread quickly. Newspapers carried the images. Blood-stained concrete floors. The illusion of containment shattered. Though Capone was in Florida at the time, few doubted responsibility. Public reaction shifted sharply. What had once been tolerated as underworld business now felt like massacre. The line between criminal conflict and public safety blurred. Innocents no longer seemed protected. The romance of the gangster faded. Politicians who had once benefited from silence scrambled to distance themselves. Police corruption became impossible to ignore. Federal authorities faced mounting pressure to act decisively. The massacre changed the narrative. Capone's image as a charismatic rogue collapsed under the weight of the photographs. His charity no longer softened perception. His jokes rang hollow. The violence was too visible, too stark. For Capone himself, the event marked a psychological shift. He had demonstrated dominance, but at tremendous cost. The North Side gang was weakened, but not eliminated. Bugs Moran survived. Retaliation loomed. More importantly, Capone had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Federal agencies reorganized their approach. Rather than chasing individual crimes, they began building comprehensive cases. Teams were assigned specifically to Capone. Financial records were scrutinized. Associates were pressured. Surveillance intensified. The public supported this shift. The massacre unified opinion in a way Prohibition never had. Americans who opposed the ban still wanted order. They wanted safety. They wanted the bloodshed to stop. Capone sensed the change. His movements became more cautious. His public appearances decreased. The charm remained, but it felt strained. He was still powerful, but the space around him had narrowed. Meanwhile, the broader implications of Prohibition came into focus. The massacre was no longer just about Capone. It was about the law itself. Critics argued that Prohibition had created the conditions for such violence. Supporters insisted enforcement needed strengthening. The debate intensified. Chicago itself felt the weight. The city's reputation suffered nationally. Tourism declined. Businesses complained. Civic leaders demanded federal intervention. The sense of crisis was real. For the first time, Capone appeared vulnerable. Not because his enemies had defeated him, but because the system that had allowed him to flourish was turning against him. Corruption could no longer fully protect him. Visibility now attracted danger rather than safety. The turning point had arrived. As this part settles, imagine the garage on Clark Street long after the bodies are gone. The door closed. The snow melting slowly outside. The city moves on, but something has shifted irreversibly. In the stillness that follows, we let that moment rest. And when you are ready, we will follow the federal pursuit into investigations, ledgers, and courtroom strategies that would finally begin to dismantle Capone's empire. Part 15. Federal strategy shift, money trails, and investigations. As we move gently onward, the noise of gunfire and headlines fades into a quieter, more deliberate sound. The scratch of pens on paper. The rustle of files being opened and closed. The steady ticking of clocks in government offices. The war on the streets had failed to contain Al Capone. Now, the battle shifted to something far less dramatic, but far more dangerous to him. Accounting. After the St. Valentine's Day massacre, federal patience ended. The violence had embarrassed the nation. It had exposed the failure of Prohibition enforcement and the limits of local corruption. Public pressure mounted, not just in Chicago, but across the country. The federal government could no longer afford to appear powerless against a man who openly mocked the law. Yet prosecutors faced a problem. Capone was insulated from direct crime. He rarely gave orders in writing. He surrounded himself with loyal intermediaries. Witnesses vanished or recanted. Police files were incomplete. Murder cases dissolved quietly. The traditional tools of law enforcement slid off him without leaving a mark. So federal officials changed tactics. Rather than focusing on what Capone did, they focused on what he earned. The idea was not new. Tax law required income to be reported regardless of its source. Illegal earnings were still taxable. If Capone lived lavishly, spent freely, and reported nothing, that discrepancy could be proven. Money, unlike witnesses, left trails. The Internal Revenue Service began building a case. Agents followed Capone's spending patterns meticulously. They documented his homes, his cars, his jewelry, his travel. They collected restaurant receipts, hotel bills, and entertainment expenses. They interviewed associates not about crimes, but about payments. This work required patience. Financial investigations moved slowly. Each figure had to be verified. Each connection documented. The case would have to survive intense scrutiny. Capone's lawyers were skilled. Any mistake could collapse years of effort. Meanwhile, other federal agencies joined the effort. Treasury agents coordinated with investigators from the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI. Information was shared cautiously. Files thickened. Names reappeared across documents. Patterns emerged. Capone's organization, though careful, was large. Money moved through many hands. Bookkeepers kept records. Collectors paid wages. Suppliers issued invoices. Even criminal enterprises required documentation to function. Those documents became vulnerabilities. Some associates began to feel pressure. Lower-level members were arrested on minor charges. Faced with prison, some talked. Not about murders, but about payments. About envelopes delivered. About cash exchanged. Each statement added another thread. Capone sensed the shift. Violence no longer solved his problems. Intimidating a witness risked federal retaliation. Killing a federal agent was unthinkable. The usual tools felt dull. He attempted to adapt. Capone hired accountants and lawyers. He explored ways to legitimize income through front businesses. He adjusted spending habits. But the damage was already done. Years of excess could not be erased. Public perception also continued to harden. Newspapers began publishing estimates of Capone's wealth. Headlines questioned how a man with no official job lived so well. Editorials mocked the contradiction. The public, once amused, grew less forgiving. The investigation became symbolic. Taking down Capone was no longer just about one man. It was about restoring federal authority. About proving that no one stood above the law. The case became a test of the government's credibility. Behind the scenes, prosecutors refined their strategy. They did not need to prove every crime. They needed to prove income and failure to report it. They gathered testimony from clerks, landlords, and service providers. People who had no reason to lie. People who could describe transactions plainly. Capone's defenses weakened subtly. His reliance on cash, once protective, now worked against him. Cash transactions were harder to justify. His lack of legitimate income sources became glaring. Every luxury item raised questions. At the same time, enforcement theater played its role. High-profile raids continued. Headlines kept pressure on. Capone's movements were monitored. His name remained in the news. The stress accumulated. Capone's health declined further. Untreated illness, heavy drinking, and constant tension took their toll. He grew more irritable, more isolated. Trust narrowed to a few confidants. The public smile remained, but it was thinner now. Federal officials waited. They resisted rushing. They wanted a case that would hold. When they finally moved, it would be decisive. By 1930, the pieces were in place. Ledgers had been traced. Testimony secured. The narrative formed clearly. Capone had earned millions. He had paid nothing. The law was precise. The violation undeniable. The indictment came quietly. No dramatic arrests. No shootouts. Just papers filed and charges read. Tax evasion. Conspiracy. Numbers replacing gunfire. For Capone, the shift was devastating. He had built his empire on managing violence and corruption. He had not prepared for a system that spoke in figures and statutes. The battlefield had changed, and he was poorly armed. As this part settles, imagine a quiet office late at night. A desk lamp glows. Papers lie neatly stacked. Outside, the city hums softly, unaware that an empire is being dismantled line by line. In the stillness that follows, we let the paperwork rest. And when you are ready, we will meet the men sent to confront Capone publicly and examine the difference between legend and reality in the enforcement of prohibition. Part 16. Eliot Ness, Enforcement Theater versus Reality. As we drift gently onward, a new figure steps into the story, one whose name would become inseparable from the legend of prohibition enforcement. His presence feels sharper, more cinematic, but the reality surrounding him is quieter and far more complex. This is where myth and method begin to overlap, and where public memory starts to simplify what was, in truth, a layered and imperfect pursuit. Eliot Ness arrived in Chicago in the late 1920s as a young Treasury agent with a clean reputation and a clear mandate. The federal government, frustrated by corruption and public ridicule, needed a symbol of resolve. Ness, disciplined and determined, fit the role. He believed in the law, believed it could be enforced, and believed that integrity itself could be a weapon. The press embraced him almost immediately. Ness led a small team of agents tasked with targeting Capone's liquor operations. They were carefully selected, vetted for honesty, and kept deliberately small to reduce the risk of bribery. Newspapers soon labeled them the Untouchables, a name that suggested purity, defiance, and moral clarity. It was a perfect headline. Raids followed. Still houses were smashed. Trucks were seized. Bottles were poured into gutters. Photographs captured agents standing amid broken barrels and spilled alcohol. These images reassured the public. Something, at last, was being done. Capone took notice, but he was not alarmed in the way the headline suggested. The raids disrupted business, certainly, but they did not dismantle the system. Capone's organization was vast. Losing a few operations was costly, but manageable. New routes opened. New suppliers were found. Corruption, though reduced within Ness's circle, still existed elsewhere. Ness represented enforcement theater more than existential threat. He embodied the idea of justice in action, but the machinery of Capone's empire was too large to be undone solely by raids. Ness himself understood this, even if the public did not. He was striking at visible nodes, not the financial core. The difference between perception and reality widened. Movies and later retellings would portray Ness as Capone's primary adversary, locked in personal combat. In truth, their paths rarely crossed. Ness focused on alcohol enforcement. Federal accountants focused on tax evasion. These efforts ran parallel, not intersecting. Ness's work mattered, but differently than legend suggests. By targeting breweries and distribution centers, he increased pressure. He raised costs. He demonstrated that not all agents could be bribed. This chipped away at Capone's sense of invulnerability. It also reassured Washington that reform was possible. Capone attempted to neutralize Ness through familiar means. Bribes were offered. They were refused. Threats were implied. They failed. Ness's team became an irritation Capone could not easily remove. This was unusual. It unsettled him. Yet Capone remained confident. He believed, correctly, that Ness alone could not bring him down. Violence was avoided deliberately. Capone understood that harming a federal agent would trigger consequences far beyond any benefit. So the conflict remained oddly distant, played out through headlines rather than confrontations. Meanwhile, the public consumed the story eagerly. Ness became a symbol of moral clarity in a morally ambiguous time. The simplicity of his narrative appealed to a nation tired of complexity. Good versus evil. Law versus crime. It was comforting. Behind the scenes, however, the real work continued quietly elsewhere. While Ness smashed stills, IRS agents built spreadsheets. While newspapers celebrated raids, prosecutors assembled witness lists. The contrast was stark. One approach was visible. The other was effective. Ness himself recognized this imbalance. Later in life, he acknowledged that Capone's downfall came through taxes, not liquor raids. His role, though important, was supportive rather than decisive. This nuance rarely survived retelling. Capone's empire, under pressure from all sides, began to strain. The cost of bribery increased. Routes were disrupted more frequently. Trust eroded. Paranoia grew. The sense of inevitability settled in. Not collapse yet, but narrowing. Public tolerance also shifted. The romance of bootlegging had faded. Violence and corruption had exhausted goodwill. Ness's visibility contributed to this change. He reminded people that the law still existed, even if imperfectly enforced. The federal government leveraged this shift carefully. They allowed Ness to remain the face of enforcement while they prepared their case in silence. The spectacle distracted attention from the real threat. Capone focused on raids while the financial news tightened quietly. This misdirection proved useful. Capone underestimated the danger of tax charges until it was too late. He had survived raids before. He believed he could survive them again. Numbers, however, were unforgiving. As this part settles, imagine a scene repeated many times in those years. A warehouse door broken open. Bottle shattered. Flashbulbs popping. Outside, reporters scribble notes. Inside, an agent stands amid the wreckage, satisfied but aware that the heart of the empire still beats elsewhere. In the stillness that follows, we let the theater fade. And when you are ready, we will step into the courtroom, into prison walls, and into the slow unraveling of a man once thought untouchable. Part 17. The trial, the prison system, Alcatraz, and health decline. As we drift gently onward, the clamor of raids and headlines fades into a quieter, more enclosed space. High ceilings give way to paneled walls. The open movement of the city narrows into hallways, benches, and locked doors. This is where Al Capone's story turns inward, away from spectacle and toward consequence. The trial began not with drama, but with procedure. In 1931, Capone was charged with federal tax evasion. There were no accusations of murder in the courtroom. No references to machine guns or speakeasies. Instead, the case centered on income, on figures written carefully in ledgers, on the simple question of whether a man had paid what he owed. Capone entered the courtroom confident. He had survived countless brushes with the law. He believed, as he always had, that influence and money could soften outcomes. His legal team was experienced. Deals were discussed. At one point, Capone believed he had secured a plea arrangement that would limit his sentence. Then the judge intervened. In a move that stunned the defense, the judge rejected the arrangement and replaced the jury, fearing corruption. The familiar safeguards Capone relied upon vanished in an instant. For perhaps the first time, the room felt hostile. The trial unfolded methodically. Witnesses testified about Capone's lifestyle. About expensive suits, luxury hotels, and lavish spending. Accountants described income streams that could not be explained legitimately. The prosecution did not need to prove where the money came from, only that it existed and had not been reported. Capone's lawyers struggled. They attempted to argue ambiguity, to question credibility, to obscure connections. But numbers were stubborn. Receipts spoke quietly but clearly. The story assembled itself without drama. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Capone was convicted on multiple counts of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined heavily, and ordered to pay back taxes. The sentence was severe by the standards of the time. It sent a clear message. Influence had limits. The public reaction was mixed. Some celebrated the fall of a symbol of lawlessness. Others felt uneasy. Capone had been taken down not for the violence everyone associated with him, but for paperwork. Yet most accepted the outcome. Order, however imperfect, had been restored. Capone entered the federal prison system disoriented but not yet broken. His first confinement was at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, a facility that, at the time, still allowed certain privileges. Capone initially received favorable treatment. Guards recognized him. Other inmates deferred to him. Messages traveled in and out. For a brief time, it seemed as though prison would be another environment to manage. Then the government made a decision. To prevent continued influence, Capone was transferred to Alcatraz in 1934. The island prison was designed specifically to isolate. It was surrounded by cold water and strong currents. Escape was nearly impossible. Communication was tightly controlled. Privilege did not exist. At Alcatraz, Capone became just another inmate. He was assigned a number. He followed schedules. He ate in silence. His reputation carried little weight. Guards enforced rules rigidly. Bribery failed. Influence evaporated. This loss of control was profound. Capone, once surrounded by subordinates and constant motion, now lived within a narrow routine. Days blended together. The social isolation was intense. He worked in the prison laundry. He played the banjo quietly during recreation periods. His laughter, once booming, softened. More troubling was his health. Capone had contracted syphilis years earlier, likely untreated or inadequately treated. By the time he reached Alcatraz, the disease had progressed to its later stages, affecting his nervous system. Symptoms appeared gradually. Memory lapses. Mood swings. Confusion. Prison doctors observed decline. Capone struggled to concentrate. He became increasingly withdrawn. Other inmates noticed changes. The man who had once commanded rooms now appeared fragile, even childlike at times. The isolation accelerated this decline. Alcatraz was unforgiving to those who weakened. There was little comfort. Little distraction. The routine, while orderly, offered no relief from the mind's inward turn. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the world changed. Prohibition was nearing its end. Public opinion had shifted decisively. The Great Depression had reshaped priorities. Alcohol was no longer seen as the central moral threat. The law that had created Capone's empire was collapsing. Inside, Capone was largely unaware. News reached him slowly, filtered and abstract. His relevance faded quietly. Younger criminals replaced older ones. Chicago moved on. By the time Capone was transferred out of Alcatraz due to declining health, he was no longer the man the public remembered. He was sent to other facilities, then eventually released early in 1939 after serving the majority of his sentence. He left prison diminished physically and mentally. Doctors described significant impairment. The illness had done its work. Capone retreated to Florida. He lived quietly with his family, under medical supervision. He fished. He walked slowly. He repeated himself often. The sharpness that had once defined him was gone. Conversations drifted. Memory fractured. The public watched briefly, then turned away. There were no final confrontations. No dramatic return. No redemption arc. Just a gradual fading, private and subdued. As this part settles, imagine a man sitting near the water, the sun low, the sound of waves steady and unhurried. The noise of Chicago feels distant, almost unreal. The empire exists only in memory now. In the stillness that follows, we allow that quiet to remain. And when you are ready, we will step back into the wider world, into the repeal of prohibition itself, and into the collapse of the economy that had once lifted Capone so high. Part 18. Repeal of Prohibition and the Collapse of the Bootlegging Economy. As we drift gently onward, the focus widens again, pulling away from the quiet isolation of prison walls and returning to the nation that created, sustained, and finally abandoned prohibition. The story of Al Capone cannot end without the story of the law that made him possible. And now, slowly, almost wearily, that law begins to dissolve. By the early 1930s, prohibition was no longer defended with confidence. What had once been framed as a moral triumph had become an obvious burden. The violence associated with organized crime had grown impossible to ignore. Corruption had seeped into police departments, courts, and city halls across the country. Instead of elevating public morality, prohibition seemed to have exposed the fragility of the legal system itself. The Great Depression accelerated this reckoning. After the stock market crash of 1929, millions of Americans were unemployed. Cities struggled to fund basic services. Tax revenues collapsed. The federal government searched desperately for new sources of income. In this environment, the continued ban on alcohol began to feel not only misguided, but impractical. Legal alcohol represented jobs. Breweries could reopen. Distilleries could operate openly. Farmers could sell grain. Bars and restaurants could employ workers again. Alcohol taxes, once a major source of government revenue, could return. The economic argument against prohibition became increasingly persuasive. Public opinion shifted decisively. Polls, editorials, and elections reflected growing support for repeal. Even many former temperance supporters quietly withdrew their enthusiasm. The law had not eliminated drinking. It had simply changed who profited from it. And those profits had fueled violence. Politicians followed the mood. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president on a platform that included repeal. He spoke of restoring jobs, reducing crime, and respecting personal freedom. His victory signaled a national change in direction. The process of repeal moved quickly. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, officially ending prohibition. It was the only amendment in American history designed to undo another. With a single stroke, the constitutional experiment ended. Alcohol returned to legality. Bars reopened. Breweries restarted production. Bottles reappeared openly on shelves. The transition felt strangely quiet. There were no riots. No collapse. Life resumed with little drama, as though the nation had simply corrected a long mistake. For the bootlegging economy, the impact was immediate and devastating. Illegal alcohol operations lost their primary purpose overnight. Speakeasies either closed or became legitimate bars. Smuggling routes went silent. Warehouses emptied. The enormous profits that had sustained criminal organizations vanished. Organized crime did not disappear, but it changed. Groups that had built their power on alcohol were forced to adapt or decline. Some shifted into gambling, labor racketeering, or narcotics. Others fractured under financial strain. Without prohibition's artificial scarcity, alcohol was no longer worth killing for. Chicago felt the shift acutely. The city's underworld lost its central commodity. Power structures weakened. Violence decreased noticeably. The era of nightly gunfire faded. Law enforcement refocused. The city exhaled. Capone, watching from a distance, was largely irrelevant by this point. His empire had already collapsed. His health had failed. The repeal confirmed what had already become true. The world that made him powerful no longer existed. The irony was striking. Prohibition had elevated Capone from obscurity to infamy. Repeal erased the conditions that allowed such figures to dominate. The law had created the monster it could not control, then quietly removed its food source. For many Americans, repeal brought relief rather than celebration. There was little nostalgia for the ban years. Instead, there was fatigue. The country wanted stability. The experiment was over. Temperance did not vanish entirely. Some states and counties remained dry. Regulations were imposed. Licensing systems created oversight. The lesson had been learned painfully. Control, it seemed, worked better than absolute bans. Culturally, the repeal marked the end of an era. The glamour of speakeasies faded. Jazz continued, but without the same illicit thrill. Drinking became ordinary again. The rebellion lost its edge. Organized crime lost its central myth. Gangsters no longer embodied defiance against an unpopular law. They became criminals again, stripped of accidental heroism. The public turned away. Capone's name lingered, but it belonged to the past. As this part comes to rest, imagine a bar reopening legally for the first time in over a decade. The door stands open. The sign is clear. No password is required. Inside, people drink without fear or excitement, simply because they wish to. The law has changed. The economy has shifted. The era has ended. In the stillness that follows, we let that closing door rest. And when you are ready, we will look at what came next, how organized crime evolved after Capone, and how memory transformed him into legend. Part 19. Chicago after Capone and the evolution of organized crime. As we drift gently onward, the story loosens its grip on one man and settles instead over a city learning how to exist after him. Al Capone's name still echoes faintly through Chicago, but the streets themselves have changed. The soundscape is different now. Fewer gunshots. Fewer headlines. A quieter recalibration, almost imperceptible, begins to take place. Capone's fall did not leave a vacuum so much as a pause. His organization had been vast, but it had also been centralized around alcohol. When Prohibition ended and Capone was removed, the system he dominated no longer made sense in its old form. Power fragmented. Smaller groups re-emerged. Former lieutenants repositioned themselves. Chicago's underworld did not vanish, but it softened its posture. Violence declined noticeably. Without the extraordinary profits of bootlegging, there was less incentive to fight openly. Alcohol, now legal, could be purchased cheaply and sold legitimately. There was no reason to kill over it. This alone altered the tone of organized crime. Those who remained adapted. Gambling became the primary focus. Bookmaking, casinos, and illegal lotteries offered steady income without the same public outrage as bootlegging violence. Labor racketeering expanded quietly, especially in industries tied to transportation, construction, and manufacturing. Control over unions provided leverage without constant bloodshed. Organized crime learned to blend in. The lesson of Capone's downfall was clear. Visibility was dangerous. Public bravado invited scrutiny. The new generation of leaders preferred anonymity. They avoided newspapers. They avoided interviews. They let others speak for them, if anyone spoke at all. Chicago's political environment shifted as well. The exposure of corruption during Prohibition had embarrassed city leaders. Reforms followed unevenly, but some stuck. Federal oversight increased. Cooperation between agencies improved. The city did not become incorruptible, but it became more cautious. Law enforcement, too, learned from failure. The Capone era demonstrated the limits of chasing spectacle. The real work, officials now understood, lay in financial records, regulatory enforcement, and long investigations. Organized crime was treated less like a battlefield and more like a corporate entity to be audited, taxed, and constrained. Culturally, the gangster lost his shine. Without prohibition, criminals no longer seemed like folk heroes defying an unpopular law. They were simply criminals again. The public, exhausted by violence and economic hardship, had little appetite for romantic narratives. Chicago turned its attention elsewhere. The city focused on recovery, infrastructure, and industry. Jazz clubs continued, but without the illicit glow that once defined them. Nightlife normalized. The shadows receded slightly. Yet the memory of Capone lingered. Stories were told and retold. Details blurred. The man became larger than life in recollection. His name was easier to remember than the quieter figures who followed. Memory prefers drama, and Capone had provided it in abundance. For organized crime nationally, the lessons were absorbed quickly. Groups across the country shifted strategies. They diversified. They emphasized insulation and deniability. Leaders remained distant from operations. Money was laundered through legitimate businesses more carefully. The era of public gangster celebrity largely ended. The federal government also adjusted its posture. Tax enforcement became a standard tool against criminal organizations. Financial crimes were pursued aggressively. The idea that money trails mattered more than gunfire became institutional wisdom. Capone's story became a case study. Law schools, criminologists, and policymakers examined it repeatedly. Prohibition was cited as an example of unintended consequences. Absolute bans, many concluded, created black markets that rewarded violence and corruption. Regulation, imperfect but flexible, seemed preferable. Chicago itself bore scars, but it endured. Cities are resilient in this way. They absorb turmoil, then continue. New generations walked streets once ruled by fear without knowing the names of those who had controlled them. Time softened edges. Capone, meanwhile, receded further into obscurity. As his health declined, he became less a symbol of power and more a cautionary figure. Newspapers reported on him occasionally, usually with a tone of curiosity rather than reverence. The once feared man was now described as confused, frail, diminished. The contrast was instructive. Capone had once seemed inevitable, unstoppable. Yet history moved on without him. Systems adapted. Laws changed. The world did not collapse, nor did it need him to function. This realization reshaped how Americans thought about crime. Individuals mattered less than structures. Laws mattered more than personalities. The myth of the singular criminal mastermind lost credibility. As this part comes to rest, imagine Chicago on an ordinary evening in the late 1930s. Streetlights glow. Bars operate openly. Music drifts without secrecy. Most people go about their lives unaware that a decade earlier, these same streets had been battlegrounds. The city has adjusted. The underworld has adapted. The story has shifted focus. In the stillness that follows, we allow that quiet transformation to settle. And when you are ready, we will step back one final time, into memory itself, and explore how myth overtook reality, and what lasting lessons remain from the age of Prohibition and Al Capone. Part 20. Cultural Memory, Myth versus Reality, and Lasting Lessons. As we drift into the final chapter of tonight's story, the noise of the era has long since faded. The gunfire, the headlines, the speeches, the courtroom arguments all soften into memory. What remains is not the man himself, nor even the law that shaped him, but the story that settled into the collective mind. This is where history slows and myth quietly takes over. Al Capone, in life, was a product of circumstance. He did not invent prohibition. He did not invent corruption, violence, or organized crime. He stepped into conditions that already existed and learned how to navigate them better than most. His rise depended less on genius than on timing, geography, and a legal framework that rewarded secrecy and scale. Yet memory rarely favors context. Instead, it favors symbols. Capone became a symbol of excess, of lawlessness, of an America struggling to reconcile morality with desire. In popular imagination, he transformed into something larger than life, a singular villain or anti-hero, depending on the telling. His story became shorthand for an entire era. This simplification began almost immediately. Newspapers exaggerated. Later books embellished. Films sharpened contrasts. Capone was portrayed as either a charming rogue or a ruthless tyrant, often both at once. The quiet logistics, the paperwork, the compromises all disappeared. Drama replaced process. The myth served a purpose. It allowed Americans to package a complicated failure into a familiar narrative. One bad man. One violent chapter. One lesson learned. It was easier than confronting the deeper truth that prohibition failed because it misunderstood human behavior and underestimated adaptability. In reality, Capone was not unique. He was the most visible figure in a much larger system. For every Capone, there were dozens of quieter operators who avoided attention and lasted longer. They did not become legends precisely because they avoided spectacle. History remembers noise more than endurance. Prohibition itself occupies a similar space in memory. It is often remembered as naive, moralistic, and doomed from the start. While there is truth in this, it overlooks the genuine motivations behind it. Temperance advocates were not villains. Many were responding to real suffering, to violence, poverty, and instability exacerbated by alcohol abuse. Their mistake was not moral concern, but absolutism. By attempting to eliminate alcohol entirely, they created conditions that rewarded criminal organization and undermined respect for law. The lesson was not that reform is wrong, but that rigid solutions to complex problems often produce unintended consequences. This lesson echoes far beyond prohibition. Later policies, from drug enforcement to other forms of prohibition, would repeat similar patterns. High demand combined with strict bans creates black markets. Black markets create violence. Violence corrodes institutions. The pattern is familiar, even if the substances and circumstances change. Capone's downfall reinforced another enduring lesson. Power built on fear and corruption is fragile. It depends on systems remaining broken. When those systems adjust, even slightly, the power collapses. Capone could manage violence. He could manage bribery. He could not manage a patient, methodical financial investigation conducted beyond his influence. The quiet tools proved stronger than the loud ones. This realization reshaped law enforcement permanently. Financial crimes, regulatory oversight, and long-term investigations became standard strategies against organized crime. The legacy of Capone's trial lived on in how justice was pursued thereafter. Culturally, the era left an imprint that never fully faded. Jazz survived. Nightlife evolved. The idea of rebellion against unpopular laws became embedded in American identity. Speakeasies became romanticized symbols of freedom rather than simple drinking establishments. The glamour endured even as the reality faded. Capone himself, in his final years, bore little resemblance to the myth. He was not feared. He was not influential. He was not even fully aware of his past. Illness stripped away ambition, memory, and identity. The man who once commanded a city ended his days quietly, attended by family, far removed from the world he had shaped. This contrast matters. It reminds us that history is lived forward but remembered backward. The end is rarely as dramatic as the middle. Power fades more often than it explodes. Legends dissolve into ordinary human vulnerability. Chicago, too, outlived the myth. The city absorbed the damage, adjusted its institutions, and continued. New challenges replaced old ones. The Capone era became a chapter, not a definition. Tourists would later seek traces of it, but daily life moved on without ceremony. In this way, the story completes itself. Prohibition rose from moral urgency. It created unintended empires. Those empires collapsed under quieter forces. The law was repealed. Memory simplified what reality had complicated. What remains is a set of lessons, still relevant, still unsettled. That laws must align with human behavior to endure. That corruption thrives where enforcement lacks legitimacy. That spectacle distracts, while systems determine outcomes. And that individuals, no matter how powerful they seem, are always temporary. As we come to rest at the end of this long journey, imagine the city at night once more. Not the Chicago of the 1920s, but a modern one. Lights glow steadily. People move without fear of passwords or raids. The streets hold echoes, but they do not relive them. And now, as our long evening together draws to a close, the city finally settles into stillness. The streets we have walked, once loud with argument, laughter, and gunfire, grow quiet under the soft wash of time. The lamps dim. The doors close gently. History exhales. We have wandered through an America that tried to legislate morality, through a nation that believed certainty could be written into law. We watched as unintended pathways opened, as desire slipped underground, and as an ordinary human appetite reshaped politics, crime, and culture in ways no one fully anticipated. We followed a boy from immigrant Brooklyn into power, spectacle, and finally silence. And then we stepped back far enough to see that even the most infamous figures are carried along by forces larger than themselves. Perhaps the most striking thing about this story is not its violence or its drama, but its impermanence. What once felt overwhelming eventually faded. The empire collapsed. The law was repealed. The city adapted. Life continued. History often feels heavy while we are inside it. But from a distance, it softens. Edges blur. The noise becomes a murmur. Lessons remain, but they no longer shout. They simply exist, waiting to be noticed. Tonight's story reminds us that systems matter more than individuals, that moral certainty can harden into rigidity, and that human behavior, when pushed too far, will always find new paths. It also reminds us that power, no matter how absolute it appears, is temporary. Time outlasts it. Quiet outlasts it. As the background historian, I thank you for letting me guide you through this long and winding chapter. For listening patiently. For drifting slowly. For allowing history to unfold without urgency. You do not need to hold on to every detail. You do not need to remember every name or date. Let the impressions remain instead. The glow of a speakeasy. The hush of a courtroom. The still water around an island prison. The simple reopening of a bar door when the experiment finally ended. If sleep is waiting for you, you are welcome to follow it now. Let the mind rest. Let the story settle gently where it belongs, in the background, softened and complete. Thank you for being here this evening. May the quiet stay with you, and may history fade kindly into rest.